Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me all right? So it's a pleasure to be here. My daughter, Christine, who's a Wake Forest grad, told me at the break that after my talk, they're going to roll the quad. And I went, really? And she said, well, we also beat Miami. So I was hoping it was because of this talk. But what I want to talk about today is drug addiction. The number up there, hopefully the font is big enough for you, $600 billion. That is the cost to the U.S. taxpayer this past year for dealing with the problem of drug addiction. That number is astronomically high. It is twice as high as any other brain disease that afflicts us. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, anxiety, depression, twice that. And what I want to tell you today is that part of the reason that it's so expensive is that we're not looking at the data. Our policies, or we do the same thing over and over again. We're spending tons of money on things that don't work. And we need to take a step back. We need to look at what the consequences of our actions are, our policies, and we need to change things, the things that work. And the bottom line is going to be, I'm going to tell you, is that the way we can reduce this number in times of tough fiscal belt tightening is through treatment, and the best way to get improved treatments is through research, and that's going to be the message today. So how do we deal with the problem of drug addiction? Basic economics is we can either affect the supply side through interdiction, border patrols, law enforcement, or we can affect the demand side through incarceration or treatment or education, prevention. And we're going to touch on most of these things today. To do this, to talk about the supply and the demand side, I want to tell you about two government agencies where your tax dollars go. One of them is the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or the ONDCP. And they have a budget, this is a 2013 budget of about $26.5 billion that's directed towards addiction. And then the other government agency I want to tell you about is NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And there's two institutes within that focus on addiction. And that's the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, and the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. If you remember one thing about this talk today, note that just in these two agencies, if these are your tax dollars, we are spending 10 times as much money on law enforcement as we are on research. So let's talk about the supply side first. So what's the idea behind that? The idea is that if we can decrease the amount of illicit drugs coming into the country, we decrease supply, we increase cost. If you increase cost, you decrease consumption. And we know that this works with regulated drugs. For example, cigarettes, we can regulate the cost. As we increase the cost of cigarettes, the consumption rate goes down. It's very orderly, it's very powerful. So what about our efforts at decreasing supply of illicit drugs? Primarily, we'll talk about cocaine and heroin. How are those efforts going? Well, I can tell you that in the over $10.5 billion that we spend last year in trying to affect supply, the amount of cocaine and heroin coming in to our country, we've not touched it. The supply has remained the same. And more importantly, to the point of economics, is that the street value, the cost of getting cocaine or heroin has dropped. For cocaine, over the last 20 years, the price has dropped 40%, and for heroin, the price has dropped over 50%. So all of our efforts, burning opium fields in Afghanistan and coca fields in Colombia, net effect, no effect on supply, and decrease in cost of cocaine and heroin on the streets. So that's probably not the way to go. Let's go to the other side of this equation, the demand side. And as Hillary Clinton pointed out, it's America's insatiable demand for illegal drugs that drives the industry. So one way that we can deal with demand, while we're on the law enforcement side of the discussion, one way we can deal with this is through incarceration. and incarceration is a form of punishment. And two psychologists wrote about punishment for many years. They're the renowned experts, Asrin and Holtz. And in one of their writings, they said that anytime you talk about punishment, it's not a neutral topic for people. And you have to ask at least, well, they say you have to ask many questions. I picked three. One is punishment effective? And the definition of punishment, by the way, is that when you do something, there's a decrease in the behavior. So in this particular case, it would be a decrease in drug taking. So the first question is punishment effective? Second question is it temporary or does it last? Are we changing behavior or are we just temporarily stopping things? And then the third is, are there other ways that you can affect behavior more effectively than punishment? There's been animal research on this, and I can tell you the answers from the animal lab are very clear, and that is that punishment is not effective in decreasing drug use. And when it is effective, as soon as the punishment is removed, drug taking returns. So you haven't changed the behavior. And thirdly, there's a premise in psychology that it's much more effective, and it turns out to be easier, to reinforce the behavior you want than it is to punish the behavior you don't want. So what about our system? What about all the money we're spending on incarceration and drug use? So let me just give you some numbers about this for those that don't know. This great country of ours, we incarcerate more of our citizens than any other country on the planet. It's not even close. Number two is not even on the same page. We are per capita 3 times higher rate of incarcerating our citizens than any other country. In addition to that, if you think about it, 1/5 of all people who are in jail on the planet, 1/5 of them are in this country. In the United States, 80% of new inmates in federal prisons are there because of drug-related issues. It costs, incarceration costs our country about $75 billion a year. So you would hope, at least, it's effective. And here's what the numbers are. If somebody goes to jail for drug use and then they're released, within 3 years, 70% of them are rearrested and 50% of them are reincarcerated. And most importantly, to this issue related to punishment, is almost all of them, I've got a pointer right here, almost all of them continue to use drugs. So we haven't punished anything, yet it's an extremely expensive option. So this is what so far I've described, just one facet, that's law enforcement, and it's pretty dead even and fairly ineffective. Now, it's not to say that law enforcement itself wouldn't be, there aren't good things that can happen. New York City took money from their prisons and put it into putting more uniformed police on the street. The result? Less crime, less arrests, lower numbers of people in prison, saves New York about $1.5 billion a year by doing that. So some law enforcement things will work. We have to look at the data, and we have to decide what works and invest in that, and things that don't work, stop spending so much money on that. Okay, well, what about the other side of demand reduction? So punishment is one way, that doesn't work. Treatment is another way. So why treatment? So here's a graph telling you what the cost is to society for dealing with addiction. And here is incarceration right here, and here's treatment over here. So some of you, hopefully not, but some of you might think, well, how about this idea? How about I don't care, it's not my problem, don't do anything. Well, that's this, oops, shoot, I didn't want to do that. That's this right here. That's the worst. It's hard to believe that there's something worse than incarceration. That's the worst thing. You should take this right here and get that out of your mind right now. Treatment is clearly the best way to handle drug addiction. So here's some numbers from the most recent monitoring of the future. These are prevalence rates of drug use in our 12th graders. And these are some of the drugs. I haven't listed the whole table. And this is their prevalence rates. And then this is the treatments that are available for these particular drugs when these 12th graders become adults later on and if the problem escalates. There are treatments for some of the drugs of abuse, but they're not effective in everybody. So we need better treatments for those. For other drugs, and I'm going to focus on the stimulants for the rest of my time, there are no Food and Drug Administration approved medications for cocaine, methamphetamine, amphetamine abuse. None. So we need research to develop treatments for these particular drugs. Animal models are really quite effective. All of these drugs here, animals will self-administer. In fact, it is the best predictive model of a human condition that's available in the world. Drugs that we abuse, animals will self-administer. So that allows us to use animals then to start developing potential treatment strategies for some of these drugs that have no treatment, or improved treatments for drugs that, such as alcohol. So here's one of the reasons why the incarceration, in my opinion, the incarceration doesn't work for drug addiction. And this was a quote from Alan Leshner that appeared in the magazine Science. Understanding addiction as a brain disease explains in part why historic policies focusing on the criminal justice aspects of drug use and addiction have been unsuccessful. If the brain is the core of the problem, attending to the brain needs to be the core of the solution. I'm going to show you some imaging data from monkeys. They have, phylogenetically, they're very close to us. They're non-humans, primates. They have the same neurochemistry, a lot of the same brain functions as we do. So let me tell you one thing about cocaine's mechanism of action that you need to know for these next couple of slides. So cocaine elevates dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is one of those chemicals in the brain that when you do something reinforcing, dopamine levels go up. Eating chocolate, having sex, for some people shopping, not me. Dopamine levels go up. Drugs of abuse elevate dopamine levels to a magnitude much greater than that, much greater. And that high level of dopamine then, it's got to find a place to go, and it docks itself at receptors and then produces effects downstream in the brain. And there are two general types of receptors, ones that stimulate activity and others that inhibit activity. And these are images from one of those receptors that inhibit activity. They're dopamine D2 receptors. And what we can do is we can scan monkeys' brains, this is a rhesus monkey, with the same instruments that we use to scan humans. And we can look at these dopamine receptors, and then we can have them self-administer drugs and find out if there's some kind of phenotype that is predictive of more or less vulnerability. And it turns out that animals that have low levels of these types of inhibitory receptors are more vulnerable to cocaine abuse than animals that have high numbers of receptors. Turns out the same is true in humans. And this all makes good sense, right? If cocaine is elevating dopamine and you have few of these inhibitory receptors, well, there's more excitation that's happening, more stimulation, you're more vulnerable. That makes really good sense. This tells us that this could be a viable target for drug development, medication development. We want to take this brain and make it look more like this. Well, what about individuals that have a long cocaine history? So here's images from two monkeys. This is before they ever had any cocaine, and this is after 1 year of cocaine exposure. And you can see that these dopamine receptors are down, robustly down. That's true in every animal that we have scanned. It's also true in humans. So again, it supports the idea that this is an important target. But we can also study abstinence and withdrawal. And so what if we just say, okay, no more cocaine, done. Well, some monkeys, and we rescan them later on, some monkeys show almost complete recovery. In other monkeys, this is a year after the last cocaine exposure. Absolutely no recovery at all. So you read in the literature, you see on talk shows, people that say, well, I used cocaine for decades. I was in the gutter. I'd lost everything. And then one day, I said no more, and it's been 3 years, 4 years, whatever. Those are great stories. Those are real. That's not the case for a lot of people, though. What I think is that that particular scenario, maybe this is what's modeling it. Maybe this is that kind of situation where in abstinence, there's full and rapid recovery of receptors. For others, though, there isn't, and this would suggest that this individual needs medication, some kind of treatment. If we could figure out why this happens, why there's complete recovery in this animal and not in this animal, that would give us more signals as to what we could do to develop novel treatments for treating addiction. So, I can't read that far, but so I've given you only one example of the type of research that goes on in this lab and in a lot of other labs, and that's just looking at cocaine's effects on the brain. But drug taking doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs in an environment, and in many cases in a social environment. And this also can be studied in the animal lab. Monkeys in the wild and in the lab, you put them together, they form a hierarchy. And with the most dominant monkey, this guy's got a treat over here, the most dominant monkey on one end and the most subordinate monkey on the other end of this continuum. If these monkeys, if we scan these animals, they've never had any cocaine. If we scan them, it turns out that their dopamine receptors are vastly different, and they're different as a result of their social their rank in the social hierarchy. Dominant monkeys have high levels of these dopamine receptors. Subordinate monkeys have low levels. These subordinate animals are more vulnerable to cocaine than these dominant monkeys. This hierarchy, by the way, is not a business hierarchy. This is not the CEO on one end of the continuum and a lowly faculty member on the other end of the continuum. It's not that at all. It's what I think it is it's a model of environmental enrichment at one end and social stress on the other end. So the subordinate monkeys more vulnerable than the dominant monkeys. But if you give them cocaine, expose both groups of monkeys to cocaine long enough, they will all self-administer cocaine. Their dopamine receptors will look the same. They will, symptomatology-wise, they will look very similar, except they're not similar. If you do something else where we look at another set of brain functions, for example, looking at glucose utilization, the way that our brains get energy is through glucose. So you can look at this, and what I want to tell you, you don't have to know anything about the structures. This is just a subtraction. This is looking at brain energy of a dominant monkey and a subordinate monkey, and it's subtracting them. If it was the same, if the neurons were using the same amount of glucose in both groups of monkeys, this would just be white and gray. But the orange tells you that these are differences. So even though the symptomatology is the same, the brains are different, and it depends, again, on their social environment. If you then decide, well, let's do something, let's introduce a little twist to this. What if we just say, well, we're going to take a dominant monkey, and we're going to put him into a new social group, and we're going to take a subordinate monkey, and we're going to put him in a new social group? What happens? Well, lots of things. Their brain activity, the response is totally different. The dominant monkey shows increases, that's what the hot red is, increases in brain activity in regions related to dopamine systems. And the subordinate monkey shows decreases in brain activation. So here again, if you just look at the symptoms, you just look at the individuals, they're both using cocaine, you make an environmental manipulation, their response, their brain response is totally different. Why in the world we would think that the same treatment is going to be effective in decreasing cocaine use in this individual doesn't make any sense. The brain is way too complicated for us to come up with one medication that is going to work in everybody. So here's my recommendations. Here are my points. One is we have to critically evaluate how we're spending money on the supply side of this equation. We're spending billions of dollars, and the consequences are pretty clear, that we're not affecting the amount of illicit drugs coming into the country. On the demand side, we need to get a grip on things. Incarceration is not a treatment, that's for sure, and is not doing anything to help the drug problem. We need to focus more on treatment, both behavioral treatments as well as developing medications. And the way we can do that is through additional research. And again, there won't be a magic bullet. The brain is just too complicated to think that there would be one medication that will work. We really need a tool chest full of possibilities. And again, researchers can develop strategies that will say, based on this genotype, this phenotype, this medication, we should try first. We won't get there, though, without research. I'll close with this from Sir Richard Bronson, who knows something about investing money and getting a return on that investment. In business, if one of our companies is failing, we take steps to identify and solve the problem. What we don't do is continue failing strategies that cost huge sums of money and exacerbate the problem. Rather than continuing on this disastrous path that we call the war on drugs, we need to look at what works and what doesn't work, and we need to do this in terms of real data. Thank you very much.